close your eyes for a moment, but keep your mind wide open. Imagine you're lying in bed, the night surrounding you in an eerie silence. You think you're alone. You think you're safe. But deep down, something feels wrong. You feel the weight of unseen eyes watching you. You hear a noise in the dark, a sound that doesn't belong. It's too late now, there's no escape. Tonight, I'm bringing you 3 true scary stories. Stories so terrifying, they'll keep you up at night, questioning every shadow, every whisper, every creak of the floor beneath your feet. These aren't just stories, they're real. Stories of unexplained disappearances, haunted places, and encounters that defy logic. You've heard the rumors, but now you'll hear the truth. Are you ready to face what's out there? If you dare, stay with me, because these tales aren't meant for the faint of heart. Let's dive into these true scary stories that will haunt you long after the lights go out. Story 1. The Disappearing Cabin. On a remote stretch of road in the Appalachian Mountains, a man named Tom set out on a solo hiking trip to get away from his busy life. He had planned to spend a few days camping in the wilderness, far from the noise of the world. The mountains were known for their rugged terrain and breathtaking views, but they also had a reputation for strange occurrences and eerie stories. Despite the warnings from the locals, Tom was excited for some peace and solitude. As he made his way deeper into the dense forest, the wind began to pick up, rustling the leaves and making the trees groan and creak. It was a kind of sound that should have been comforting, the natural noise of the forest, but Tom felt an unsettling tension in the air. The silence between the gusts of wind was thick and heavy, almost oppressive. He couldn't help but feel like something or someone was watching him, but he pushed the thought aside. After all, he was just here to relax. It was then that he spotted it. An old, run-down cabin nestled between 2 massive oak trees. It stood as a strange anomaly, its windows boarded up and the door slightly ajar, as though it had been abandoned for years. But the odd part was that the cabin looked different than anything Tom had ever seen. It was an out-of-place relic of the past, standing untouched, like it had been frozen in time. His curiosity got the better of him, and he approached it, his boots crunching against the dry leaves as he crossed the overgrown yard. The door creaked open as he pushed it, revealing the dusty interior. The air was thick with the scent of decay and mildew, the kind of smell that lingers in places untouched by time. It was a far cry from the bustling, modern life he had left behind. But as he stepped further inside, something didn't sit right. The wooden floors were warped and uneven, and there was an unsettling stillness to the place. The only sounds were the distant howls of the wind outside. His unease grew with every step he took. Despite this, Tom decided to make the cabin his base for the night. It was better than sleeping under the stars, he reasoned. He set up his camping gear and lit a small fire in the makeshift hearth. As the night began to fall, the temperature dropped, and the forest seemed to close in around him. Shadows stretched long and dark across the walls of the cabin, creating distorted shapes that danced in the flickering firelight. The air felt heavier, thicker. The silence outside was deafening, but the deeper silence within the cabin was suffocating. Suddenly, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was moving toward the cabin. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he froze. Listening intently, the footsteps grew louder, closer. His throat tightened, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer alone. He couldn't help but glance toward the door, his eyes darting around the room. He stood up, holding his breath, and crept toward the window, trying to see who or what was approaching. There was no one. Confused, Tom stepped outside to investigate. The wind had picked up again, and the world seemed eerily quiet. As he walked further into the yard, he noticed something horrifying. Fresh footprints in the dirt leading directly to the cabin. The prints were deep, as if someone had recently walked there. But that wasn't the worst part. The footprints had not been there when he first arrived. He would have noticed. Tom's stomach twisted in fear. He turned around to head back inside, but when he glanced over his shoulder, the cabin was gone. Gone. Vanished without a trace. No cabin, no footprints. Just a small clearing surrounded by trees. He spun around, looking wildly, trying to make sense of it. He had to be hallucinating, right? His heart was pounding in his ears, and his breath came in ragged gasps. He ran back to the spot where the cabin should have been, but it was just empty forest. He called out into the void, his voice echoing back at him, but there was no response. Desperate, he retraced his steps, hoping to find some sign that would explain what he had just witnessed. But nothing. The forest was silent, and the cabin was gone. Completely gone. He turned and stumbled back in the direction of his car, his mind racing. The isolation of the mountains weighed heavily on him, the silence pressing in around him like a suffocating blanket. As he drove away the next morning, he passed the same stretch of road. There was nothing, no cabin, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. The locals, when he asked, told him a story about an old cabin that would appear and disappear with the changing seasons, tied to a tragic event from years ago. Some even said it was cursed. But Tom didn't stay long enough to find out. His experience in the mountains haunted him long after he left. He had no explanation for what happened, but he would never forget that night when the cabin vanished and left him standing alone in the woods, unsure if it had ever existed at all. The haunted elevator. In the heart of a bustling city, a young woman named Rachel found herself working late at her office building. The building was a towering skyscraper, an impressive feat of architecture that had been standing for decades. It had an air of grandeur, and on most days, it buzzed with the activity of workers coming and going. But tonight, the building felt empty, silent, as if the city itself had withdrawn. Rachel worked alone on the top floor, and by midnight, the building felt like it had become a ghost town. The usual hum of fluorescent lights, the distant murmur of voices, and the rhythmic tapping of keyboards were all absent, replaced by an unsettling stillness. It had been a long week, and she was anxious to go home. She had spent most of her night putting together reports, her eyes blurry from staring at the computer screen. Finally, she decided it was time to call it a night. She grabbed her things and headed toward the elevator, the soft click of her heels echoing in the empty hallway. But as she reached the elevator, something felt wrong. It wasn't just the isolation of the building or the stillness in the air. There was an odd sense of foreboding, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. She stepped inside and pressed a button for the ground floor. The doors slid shut with a soft chime, and the elevator began its descent. At first, everything seemed normal. But then, just as the elevator passed the 10th floor, there was a sudden jolt. The lights flickered, and the entire elevator lurched downward. Rachel gasped, her stomach rising in her throat. The elevator came to a halt, the lights dimming to almost nothing. She pressed the emergency button, but the panel remained unresponsive. She pounded on the doors, shouting for help, but her voice only echoed back at her. The building was silent. Then, the strangest thing happened. The elevator began to move again, but this time, it didn't stop at the next floor. It continued descending, far past the ground level. Rachel's heart raced. She could hear her breath quicken as the elevator continued its downward plunge, far beyond what seemed normal. The temperature inside the elevator dropped, and she could see her breath in the dim light. The buttons on the control panel began flashing erratically, as if they were trying to signal something. But the symbols on the buttons were no longer recognizable. They had changed into strange, unearthly markings that pulsed with a faint glow. Finally, the elevator doors opened, but when Rachel looked out, she froze in terror. She didn't recognize the hallway in front of her. The walls were dark, the air heavy and still. It was as if she had stepped into another time altogether. The hallway was bathed in an eerie, dim light that flickered and hummed as if the building itself was struggling to keep its lights on. The air smelled stale and musty, like a forgotten part of the building that hadn't been touched in decades. The elevator doors slammed shut behind her, trapping her in there. A figure appeared at the end of the hall, tall, gaunt, and dressed in a vintage suit that looked strangely out of place. His face was hollow, his eyes dark and sunken, staring at her with an unnerving intensity. He didn't speak. He just stood there, watching her. Frozen with fear, Rachel couldn't move, couldn't scream. Every instinct in her body screamed to run, but her legs wouldn't respond. As she watched the figure, she felt a sense of dread wash over her, as if she had just made a grave mistake by stepping into this unknown place. The elevator jolted back to life, the doors opening once again on the ground floor. The hallway, the figure, everything was gone. The building was silent. Everything appeared normal, as though nothing had ever happened. But Rachel knew better. She had felt the presence in that hallway. She had seen the man, and she knew that what she experienced that night was no coincidence. Rachel never returned to that building again. Later, she found out from former employees that the building had once been the site of a horrific murder-suicide many years ago. The elevator was said to malfunction regularly, but no one had ever experienced what Rachel did. Some say the ghost of the man still roams the halls, waiting for his next victim. Story 3. The Man in the Window. Late one night in a small town in Maine, a family of 4, John, Laura, and their 2 young children, moved into a modest house on a quiet street. The house had been vacant for years, but it was a charming home, and the price was right. They had been looking for a fresh start, away from the stress of their city life. The kids were excited about having a big backyard to play in, and John and Laura were looking forward to some peace and quiet. But from the very first night, there was an odd sense of unease about the place. The house had an old, worn-down feeling to it, even though everything seemed intact. The walls creaked, and the floorboards groaned underfoot as if the house itself was alive. Still, they tried to settle in. As the evening grew darker, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the trees outside sway violently. The kids fell asleep quickly, but John and Laura couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. John decided to check on the children before going to bed. As he walked past their bedroom window, he froze. Across the street, through the thick curtain of rain, he could make out a figure standing in the window of a house that should have been empty. A man. He was staring directly at John, his hands pressed against the glass. John squinted, trying to make out his features in the rain-soaked glass. The figure was tall, with a gaunt face and hollow eyes. His expression was emotionless, vacant. John's blood ran cold. He waved, thinking it was a neighbor, but the man didn't move. He just stood there, unmoving, watching. The rain dripped down the glass, and John felt a chill creep up his spine. He stepped closer to the window, tried to get a better look. When he glanced down the street to see if anyone else was around, the man was gone. In fact, the entire street was empty, the houses dark and silent. Confused, John decided to tell Laura, but when they checked the window together, there was no sign of anyone across the street. The storm continued to howl, but everything outside appeared normal. That night, John couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the man's vacant stare. Something felt wrong, as if they were being watched. The next day, John went outside to ask the neighbors if they knew the man, but no one seemed to recognize him. One neighbor, however, told John a chilling story. She said that the house across the street had once been owned by a man who had mysteriously vanished years ago. His family had disappeared along with him, and no one ever found out what had happened. The house had been empty ever since. Later that week, as they were having dinner, Laura asked John why he hadn't closed the curtains in the children's bedroom. He stared at her, confused. He was sure he had closed them, but when he went to check, he found that the curtains were wide open. Worse yet, the window was covered in handprints, smudges of dirt and grime as if someone had been pressing their hands against the glass from the outside. By then, John and Laura knew something was wrong, and when they finally decided to leave the house, they couldn't shake the feeling that they had been living under the watchful eyes of something that had never truly left the house. The family moved out that weekend, leaving behind the strange encounter with the man in the window. And although they left, they would always remember that unsettling gaze, like something that was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. If you enjoyed these chilling stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a terrifying tale. Have you ever experienced something unexplainable? Share your eerie encounters in the comments below for more spine-tingling horror. Check out our other videos and follow us for new nightmare-inducing stories every week. Stay safe, stay aware, and if something feels off, trust your instincts. You never know what might be lurking just out of sight.